Welcome to Living Transplant,
the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the transplant program at Toronto General Hospital
and brings you open and honest conversations about the transplant experience.
My name is Courtney, and I'm the communications specialist for the Center for Living Organ Donation.
And my name is Brittany. I'm a bedside nurse in the Ajmera Transplant Center.
Full disclosure, we are not physicians.
No, and we are not here to give you medical advice.
Think of us like your guides through the world of transplant as we know it.
Whether transplant is your past, present, or future, your passion, or your curiosity,
Living Transplant will show you the world of transplant like you've never seen it before. Welcome back to Living Transplant. Today we're wrapping up Heather Lannon's story. So if you haven't listened to part 1, which was our last episode, we strongly encourage you to go do that now. Actually, we demand that you go do it now. So don't listen to part 2 without listening to part 1. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go do it right now.
It should be like in Spotify or Apple Music where it's like you can't listen past this point if you haven't
like
played
a prerequisite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where we last left off with Heather's story, just to jog your memory, was after a complicated and unsuccessful transplant, Jamie passed away peacefully at Toronto General. Picking up from there, we're getting into Heather's PhD research on the connection between home and the transplant journey. Fun new word to add to your vocabulary from this episode is, Courtney, take it away.
Autoethnography. So essentially, it's a type of research that uses self-reflection and writing to explore a personal experience and connect it to the wider meaning and understanding of other social and cultural issues and experiences.
Very cool. She said. Okay. So this episode also digs a little deeper into what it's really like to be a caregiver, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as well as mental health for patients with chronic disease. Some really fascinating and raw insights in this episode.
Oh, and Heather also gave us a little something to share with everyone. So you'll remember from last episode that Jamie was a musician, and Heather gave us a recording of his song, The Heart Pump Blues, which was performed live for a group of friends and family. So we'll play that at the end of the episode for you all.
So without further ado, part 2 of Heather Lannon.
I remember back when we were able to go out for drinks, you telling me about how your PhD came about, which was more that Jamie had said to you at one point, like, if I die, I want you to go on and get that PhD and don't let anything hold you back. Yeah. At that point, had you kind of formulated what you wanted to research for your PhD?
So the PhD, anybody who knows me knows that I absolutely love going to school. And if I could be a professional student, that would be the best job in the world. So there wasn't ever a doubt that I would do a PhD. But what did I want to do it in? The first time that I started talking about it out loud, because, these things you never, ever say out loud, because if you tell people you want to do a PhD, then you actually got to follow through and kind of do it. But, but yeah, I started, I always journaled. And, it was very early on in the whole relocating, moving to Toronto, that I started to actually think like, this could be a project. This is really interesting. And what had happened was it was very early 2015. We'd only been here, I don't know, 6 months maybe. And we started to meet other people from Newfoundland. Newfoundlanders just find each other. But, you would never think that you'd keep bumping into Newfoundlanders in a hospital in downtown Toronto. Like that just seems strange. How many sick Newfoundlanders are there that needs to go to Toronto? And that's kind of how it came about. I started to think more so about money, like how much was the government paying to send all these people here? Like, is there a better way to provide care? And then I started to think about patient outcomes and thinking about, does the patient who has to leave home to get treatment, do they do as well as people who get treatment in their own area? Like, does the stress of having to travel play into that? How does one group do compared to the other? And if I'm bumping into this many people on the heart floor at Toronto General, how many are there in the whole hospital? And not just Newfoundland. We get people here at our hospitals from all over the world. If they're on the heart floor, then they're probably across the street at Princess Margaret getting cancer treatment. They're probably, particular liver patients or lung patients or whatnot, or even families coming to sick kids with their kids. So I started to seek out people who might work in the field and might be able to provide some guidance or to tell me at least if I was crazy or on the right track or anything. One of the first people I met with, she was a lung transplant physician. She's still at Toronto General. And I just messaged her and said, hey, I got this idea and I want to run it by you. She agreed to meet with me. I think Jamie was an impatient and I just walked upstairs to her office and I ran the idea by her, and she actually said it was a really good project. And I remember sitting there going, oh my God, I just met with this person who's so into transplant and was probably one of the heads of the transplant program. And she thinks that what I'm saying makes sense. And she gave me some really, really good advice because I really was looking at outcomes and I was looking at finances and all kinds of things. And I have a social work background. So she said to me, stick with what you know. You know social work, you know mental health. Why are you trying to look at the financial piece? Why are you trying to look at outcomes like a medical piece? Go with what you know. And I've seen her in the hospital a couple of times. She has no idea, I think, who I am, but eventually I'll go back to her and tell her that, she was really instrumental in making me think of how to put this all together into a project.
I remember too, you explaining your research question to me, and I found it very striking not being from Toronto myself. I mean, I've been here for 10 years, but I also come from an island and it is part of my identity, just like Newfoundland is very much a part of your identity. Like when did the term or like the concept of home start coming into your research question?
So the whole research question, and if anybody's done any type of research, your question probably changes 100 times over. It went from, looking at the mental health and looking at supports. And then I really sat down and thought about what is it that these people all have in common? And it was everybody wanted to go home. And I thought initially that was unique to Newfoundland patients. Newfoundland, very small, close knit island, like you said, community. I have relatives here who moved away from Newfoundland 30 plus years ago and still talk about going home. And there's actually a saying, how do you spot a Newfoundlander in heaven? And it's the only person there that wants to go home. So there's this real longing to be part of that particular place. The research question ended up being, how is home connected to the transplant journey?
This might be a dumb question, but I've never been to Newfoundland to myself. What makes Newfoundland so special to wanting to go home so bad?
It's a great question. What the place is known for is really friendly people. It's a very small town vibe, small town community where everybody helps everybody out. I was saying, I don't know if it was to Courtney today, but I was telling somebody, as we know, we have the Team Newfoundland here helping us in our ICUs with the COVID patients. And coincidentally, I actually know one of the people on the team. So it's such a small place that everybody knows everybody. And I just think it's just this really friendly atmosphere. Being on an island, you kind of got to be hardy. Really, we're stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where, it's raining, fogging, snowing, freezing cold most of the time. Courtney, you've been there as a visitor. Is that the same vibe that you got?
Yeah, I had the childhood obsession with Newfoundland, maybe because it was on the opposite side of the country from where I grew up in Victoria, but I had always wanted to go there. And when I was 19 or 20, I actually hitchhiked around Newfoundland, as foolish and crazy as that. I don't think I would ever hitchhike anywhere else, but everyone was so friendly. Every car I got into, everyone was like, what the hell are you doing out here? Like, get in the car. Like, do you need somewhere to stay? Do you need like food or whatever? And it was like, no, I'm just going to hostels. So like I have a destination, and people were just so friendly. But I mean, I can't say what it is as an outsider, but there is this real sense of just community and hospitality. I felt very at home and very welcomed by everyone that I met.
How did you find people for your project? Like, although you ran into a couple people here and there and you're like, I know this guy, I know this girl, but how did you come up and find other people around the hospital to help?
initially thought that, hey, this is awesome. I work in transplant. I have a whole patient population that I can tap into. But, as you know, I don't work with heart patients. I at the center for living donation. So liver, kidneys, no hearts whatsoever. There was a thought about opening it up to all organ groups, but I just wanted to honor Jamie. And well, I think that, the research will apply to anyone leaving home for treatment, whether it's transplant, cancer, whatever. I just really wanted it to represent him. So I stuck with hearts. I'm really glad I stuck with hearts. And the best piece about having some personal connection to transplant was that I had built up networks. So as you know, patients talk, patients connect with each other. I was involved in a lot of different patient groups. At our hospital, we have the HeartLinks group, HeartLife, another group that I'm involved with that's originated out of BC but is national. And then also I'm involved with the Canadian Transplant Association, so another national organization. So I was able to tap into transplant communities pretty much throughout the whole country, which was pretty cool when I think about that. I had thought I'd focus on Newfoundland patients only. I thought about even just saying maybe Atlantic provinces, but, I think this issue of relocating to access care is a Canada-wide issue. And Courtney will know that a lot of our transplant programs take people from other provinces. We do all the livers for Manitoba. So those folks are coming to us. We're one of the few lung programs in the country that takes really complex cases that nobody else wants to do. So I opened it up to all of Canada, and I literally shared it through social media, through word of mouth, through emails, and I was really, really happy with the response. I ended up with 19 in total, 11 patients and 8 caregivers. I was just going to do patients, but I have a wonderful committee, a wonderful, wonderful PhD committee who said to me, Heather, you know what? Your experience is important too. And I really think that you should highlight your experience and other caregivers' experience too, because they relocated as well, not just the patient. So last April and May, while we were in lockdown, I did all 19 interviews through Zoom, listening to their stories. It just blows my mind how resilient people are and what they go through and what they can overcome.
I was going to ask, has obviously COVID's changed maybe how you format the interviews and whatnot, but has it changed the concept of people just wanting to go home more? Because I feel like the idea of home has changed so much through COVID. We obviously have to stay home, but our patients are so sick, and it's this conflict. I have to stay home, but at the same time, I should be in hospital, and then my family can't come visit me.
So everybody was post transplant except for one who was on LVAD waiting for transplant. So a lot of them were already gone home. So their challenge was more so around, do I travel back during COVID? Right? Do I leave home and now come back to my appointment for my biopsy or whatever it might be? So that was their challenge. But for the people who were still away, I think isolation was playing a big role. But, I did 19 interviews, and in every single interview, I could see a little tiny bit of me or Jamie, some more than others, but there was some that I really felt like the person was regurgitating my story.
And was that challenging? I don't think we can just easily gloss over how insane it is that you relocated here for your husband's heart transplant. He passes away. You decide you still want to work in transplant. You want to do your PhD in transplant. How does that not all get muddled up when you're interviewing these people and hearing their own individual stories? How do you separate the personal from the academic?
You should be on my committee. They ask me that all the time. They're like, do you have your research hat on? It's totally hard. And I think just recognizing biases and really trying to separate yourself from the research. Part of it was create an interview guide, make sure you're covering all the questions that relate back to the research question, that you're looking at things with a critical eye. And in addition to the interviews, the other part of the research is, I find this even far more difficult, is what we decided to do was use me and Jamie almost as a participant in the research. I had documented the whole journey, and I decided to analyze those journals that I kept just as if we were also a participant. And I found that 100 times harder than the patient stories. But some stories stood out more than others. Some I would hang up and just sit there and go, like, there was one girl, and like, this was a moment that how people say the hairs on the back of your neck stood up. That's exactly what happened. And I was on Zoom with her, and I remember thinking, okay, stay, like, poker face, stay calm. And she was chatting with me and telling me about going to surgery. She said, yeah, you won't even believe what my last words were before I went to surgery. I winked at the doctor and I said, and this is a very specific Newfoundland expression. I said, come on, guys, let's get this show on the road. And that was Jamie's that was the last words I ever heard him say.
Wow.
And I just sat there and I'm like, I'm looking at her on Zoom and then I'm thinking, did I dream this? Like, am I hallucinating? Am I like just, and she said, yeah. And they all laughed because I had my thick Newfoundland accent and they didn't really get it. And all I kept thinking was, oh my God, like, I need to get off this call.
Did it take you back to that feeling of like being in the room and being like, I need to run away? Like, was it a little bit of that?
That closing in effect.
It kind of was. And I was like, I'm not a religious person, but like at that moment, I really was kind of like looking around in my apartment. Does he hear this? Like,
is he right behind me?
Yeah. I was like,
Jamie, are you hearing this right now? Like,
I was like, this is creepy. I played researcher, totally cool, and continued on with the interview. And then after I hung up, I was like, I had like goosebumps on my arm and everything. And I remember phoning my mom saying, holy shit, you're not going to believe what just happened.
Whenever they tell you those things, are you like in your research, do you like, is it like a conversation like, oh my gosh, like that's so crazy? Or do you just let them talk, or do they know any parts of your story?
So in the informed consent part, I tell them right up front at the beginning, I'm required to let you know that I have personal experience with the topic I'm studying. My husband was in need of a transplant and I was his caregiver. I'm relocated with him from Newfoundland to Toronto. That's pretty much all I tell them. But it's semi-structured interviews. I really like to hear people's stories. So I always just used to start off with just a very general question, similar to what Courtney did. Tell me your connection to transplant. So I would just say, tell me about, your transplant journey. Tell me what it was like to relocate. Tell me about your experience. And people seem to be familiar with telling their story. They seem to have done this. So they usually go through it pretty quickly. And there was times when I would fill in some stuff. They were, I was on this drug and it was really horrible. And you could only get it in IV and it was in CCU and it made me so sick. And what was the name of it? And I'm like, Milnerone. Yeah, I know what that, right? Like I would sometimes say, they'd be like, I had this fantastic doctor. It was so-and-so. And I would say, oh my God, I know that person too, that kind of thing. So that was really interesting, but I don't think I could have done it without telling them my connection.
Courtney was saying, is it difficult to separate academia and personal stories? But I would think that maybe it might be difficult, but I would assume that it creates a version of empathy to be able to relate to these people's stories. And obviously it might be difficult to separate them, but you're like, yep, I totally understand where you're coming from. And you can run with that. Like you can lead with that when it comes to your research, obviously, right?
Yeah. A lot of what I do all kind of meshes into one now at this point in time. There's lots of things I do in my professional role at the center that I've learned from my personal experience. I love being able to look at someone and say, I know what you're experiencing or going through and actually really actually mean that. But yeah, separating it is, sometimes hard, but I do agree. Like I would never have done the academic piece if the personal piece didn't exist. I think they do go hand in hand. I'm really glad that I did my research project the way I did with doing the patient interviews and the caregiver interviews, which is that real academic research study piece, and then also combining it with my journals and my own experience, which is more of the personal piece, but also showed me how the personal can become academic, which I think is really neat. This whole field of, it's called autoethnography, is something that's coming up in research more and more, where people with personal experience are actually being the researcher, but also being in the research.
Having a personal experience and a connection to something that you're passionate about, such as this, just makes you work that much harder.
Yeah, and I think too, Jamie wanted me to do this. So Jamie knew I got into this program. He knew I had applied and then I had been accepted. And when I got accepted, I remember saying, like, I can't go do this. You're waiting for a transplant. You got a heart in a bag on your side. Like, I can't leave you here. You know, he really, really wanted me to go and really felt that I deserved it, and that whatever I did with the project and the idea, it would make a difference. So definitely going, I think, was helpful. And I started this 2 months after he died is when I started my PhD. So
Wow.
I probably was crazy and having widow brain or something, but so both the patient interviews as well as my own journals showed us 3 key things. So it showed what the challenges were for both patients, caregivers, and me, what the supports or what things helped, and then also the definitions of home. So, in terms of challenges, when we relocated, we all found accommodations to be a major concern. For most people, they were coming to a big city, and we all know the cost of living here in Toronto is insane. So, having to find affordable accommodations, that kind of ties into the next one, finances. Travel is super expensive, having to be off work, again, finding a hotel, Airbnb, all that adds up. Money was challenging. Lack of mental health support and emotional support. We hear this time and time again in all kinds of programs, that there really needs to be more emphasis on mental health and supports for people. And I think that's more so for people who relocate to access care, because they've left their families, they've left everybody behind. They have no support system. So they need those extra mental health, emotional supports. And then finally, the being an out of province patient. We live in Canada. It's a wonderful country that has universal health care, but every single province has their own health plan. So when I came here to Ontario, I was using a health plan from Newfoundland. I wasn't using OHIP, which we have in Ontario, and those two systems don't talk to each other at all. They're completely separate. So coverage, benefits, all that kind of stuff is completely messed up, for lack of better words. So those were the challenges. And I do have a wonderful, wonderful story to tell you. It wasn't wonderful at the time, but it's a great example of the challenges of out of province patients and benefits and coverage. So one of the challenges, or that those were the challenges, and then the supports or the things that made things easier was I had a wonderful, wonderful supportive family. My mom, my dad, and my sister. I don't know how I would have done any of this without them, from doing stuff back in Newfoundland for me to flying up here. I think my mom said in 3 years that we were here, she bought like 40 something airline tickets. Like, it was something crazy. And then my sister too was also fantastic. She rented my house while I was in Newfoundland and that kind of thing. So they were wonderful. I had family here, extended family, who stepped up and made sure that we were fed and had places to stay and drives and took us grocery shopping and filled in as our parents. Without that support here, I don't think I would have been able to do it on our own. And then the other 2 pieces that were really helpful was the medical team. I really don't think the team knows the role that they play. And a lot of those people that we dealt with were family by the end of it. They just weren't doctors and nurses. They were our family. So that was important. And then finally, other patients and caregivers. It's, nobody knows what you're going through except other people who are going through it. So connecting with those people and really forming bonds and be able to have somebody you can sit and say, this happened today, and they actually understand what you're talking about. So those were the challenges and the supports. And then obviously, seeing the whole project was about home, I wanted to know what home meant to the patients and caregivers. So they kind of defined home in 2 different ways. They defined it as people. So home meant friends, family, loved ones. Some people even talked about their pets, their community, their neighbors. And then they also defined home as feelings. So they'd say home was a place that was safe. It was a place that was warm and welcoming. It was a place of comfort, belonging, words like that. So when I put it all together, I didn't have a definition of home. I wasn't smart enough when I wrote those journals to write down, I think home is. I didn't know I was going to do the PhD. So it was clear from my writings that home was Newfoundland. Home was my house in Newfoundland, my mom and dad's house, that kind of thing. It was very physical for me. But when I looked at all the findings and I put it all together, it became obvious that home wasn't a physical place. It wasn't a geographical location. It wasn't a province. It wasn't a home or a house. It was people. It was the people around those patients and caregivers and how those people made them feel. So home was the medical team, it was the other patients, it was the other caregivers, it was their families, and it was the feelings those people created. So the medical team made people feel safe. The other patients and caregivers was like a sense of community and belonging, and other family and friends was comfort. And then just to be totally cheesy and tie back to hearts, I always like end it with home really is where the heart is, because that's where family, friends, feelings are. So that was the findings in a nutshell.
Do you have any stories or diary entries that you could share with us?
Absolutely. So this particular lady, she was a caregiver of a patient, and they had been medevaced from Newfoundland to Toronto. And she's talking about accommodations. And she said, they had just flown, they've been traveling all day, and it's now nighttime, and she's at the hospital. And I'm there with a backpack and 2 suitcases. And the nurse comes in and says, "You can't sit here overnight. You have to find somewhere to go. I don't know anyone in Ottawa. I don't know where to go. I'm not familiar with the area, and I have extreme anxiety." And she actually was told to leave and found, luckily in Ottawa, they have a residence close by that patients can stay at. But she was this was like 11 p.m. at night trying to find somewhere to stay after just being told your husband had to be medevaced. So, I think, that's really important for medical professionals to realize, like, yes, you're there taking care of the patient is a priority, but this is also important to care for the family too.
In nursing school, they teach you that your patient is not just the one patient, your patient is the entire family. It's everyone that is involved with that particular patient is my patient.
So that was a caregiver, and that was accommodations. Then we spoke with someone, this is a patient, and he was telling me about the financial ramifications from having to relocate to access care. And he was on the west coast of Canada. He was going to Vancouver. So again, another very expensive city. And he said, I could have got a little wee apartment about 400 or 500 square feet, and it was like $1,500 a month. So it was quite a hardship for me in terms of money. But I said, there's not going to be any money if I die one way or another. I just want to live. It was pretty stressful. I drained my sources so bad that I had to declare bankruptcy. I lost everything. Yeah. Yeah. And I just remember sitting there listening to him say that. And I believe this gentleman was retired. So, in my mind, I was thinking he probably worked his whole life, was retirement age, and then needed a transplant. And this happened to him. And in order to save his life, he lost everything. So just makes us think about the position that we put people in. What are you going to choose? Are you going to choose to live or exhaust every single amount of savings?
Yeah. I know that Jamie was not a huge fan of Toronto, and understandably so, given that all of his associations with Toronto were being sick. Do you have any journal entries that talk about Jamie's yearning for home and any of his definitions of home, or any quotes that reflect what you remember Jamie's definitions were?
I really wish that I had to. Obviously, hindsight's 2020, but I wish I had to think then, hey, I'm going to do a PhD on home. I better document all this.
Oh my
But
God, don't be ridiculous.
I was actually going to write a book. That's how it all started. I was documenting it because I wanted to write a memoir or something. But with Jamie, I really think that the move really impacted his mental health, and that really, really suffered. He was normally a happy-go-lucky, real comedian jokester type person. And when he got here, he just kept getting sicker and sicker, and nothing seemed to be working. And he just turned into a very depressed, if I want to be really honest, very difficult to live with person. He was very, very moody, very agitated easily, and just was really on edge at all times. And I had a big section here on Jamie's mental health, because I think that played a really big role and ties back to the piece I talked about, lack of mental health services. And he did have access to psych at Toronto General for the first little while. He also had access to mental health nursing, which was helpful, but I don't feel like it was enough. The anxiety was a little bit over the top, to say the least. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but he was so anxious. And you can kind of understand it when people are telling you that you have a life-threatening illness, you could die. This is a March 2015 entry that I had written. What was going on here was the plan had been to see if Jamie would be able to function, I guess, in real life. The doctors had put in his pacemaker and defibrillator and had wanted him to get kind of back out into the real world to see if, it made a difference and if he could actually go to work, do things that he enjoyed. So it starts with, I get a call from Jamie. He was supposed to go to work for 1 p.m., but he tells me he just can't do it and that he is not able. My plan had been to go to the gym, but that changed, and I ended up going home to make sure he was okay. I even did the "Are you going to hurt yourself" checklist before I left to head home. I really didn't think Jamie would do anything like that, but there have been so many times that I heard him say, "I don't know how much more of this I can take. It's so not fair." And then the entry goes on to talk about the next day. So it says, he woke me up in the middle of the night thinking he was dying. He was burping, throwing up, and urging a lot. I asked him if he wanted to go to the hospital, and he didn't. He kept saying that he didn't know how much more of this he could take. I got him an Ativan and calmed him down. He got in bed with me. I rubbed his back and talked to him until he fell asleep. Finally, he went to sleep, but I did not. I think when I read stuff like that, one, I think Jamie was lucky that he had a social worker for a wife, but I think it also kind of goes to show the amount of pressure too that sometimes the caregiver takes on. It was pure luck that I had mental health training. It was just pure luck. I can't imagine somebody with no skills in that area having to deal with someone who was having severe anxiety, depression. Do I think he would have harmed himself? I don't really think so, but I also know that everybody has a breaking point, and that wasn't the first time that I did a suicide checklist just to make sure. So yeah, you take on really interesting roles when you're living with somebody who has chronic illness. It's not just the wife or the, partner. You take on all kinds of weird jobs.
It's funny that there's obviously no crash course to teaching all of the different roles that the caregiver plays, because it's one thing to be somebody's wife or husband or whatever, but you're not really expecting to take on the role of a nurse, a social worker, a doctor, literally every single role. I say that because just before we got on this call, I had this exact conversation with one of my patients, trying to give her a very quick 5-minute introduction to how to measure vital signs. And I said, this is exactly what I would do if this was my husband or caregiver, but I can't put this into 5 minutes. I can't put this into 20 minutes. These are things that once you get sick or when you get a transplant for the caregiver, there's so many roles that they have to play. There's so many hats that they have to wear, and they don't get anything. And sometimes we get really lucky and have this patient's wife or patient's husband that has everything highlighted in a manual and a book, and they do their absolute best and they just want to stay on top of things. But at the same time, they're also trying to manage their own life too, and then they have to manage this person's life. There's no direction, there's no guidance on how to do it.
And I think, I always think that I'm lucky because I wore the patient caregiver hat, and now I get to wear the staff hat, which is really
Mhm.
interesting to say the least. But I don't think we even realize the pressure and the stress that we put on our caregivers and what we expect
Mhm.
them to do. We expect them to do all these things, but I don't think we realize, like, hey, what am I actually asking this person to do? And as you were talking, Brittany, I hauled up another entry. And this one was about a month after Jamie got his VAD, and he was still an inpatient. And in order for him to go home, I had to get trained on how to use the VAD. And remember, I said he had that drive line coming out of his belly. So he always had an open wound that needed to be dressed and sterilized and things like that. So in order for him to get discharged, I had to pass the VAD test.
Yeah.
And anyways, I met with the nurse practitioner, and this is what happened. She would need to test me about the VAD in order for Jamie to be discharged. She came and asked me about the parts of the device. I went on and explained everything about each part. I was at the point that I was not going to let her fail me. I then had to do the dressing change. The nurse told me I got 85%. She took off points because I touched my glove off my shirt, which meant I contaminated it. Because I didn't get 100%, Jamie was not allowed to be discharged. To say he was mad at me is an understatement. I was mad at myself, and I felt it was my fault Jamie was still in the hospital. I can't even comment on the amount of pressure I feel.
Oh, Heather. Oh, past Heather. That breaks my heart.
That is
Yeah.
so
And I
sad.
and I totally
Oh
understand
dear.
why, like,
Of course.
anybody who's
But it
worked with
breaks my
VADs,
heart. It breaks my heart though. Like that is
um,
so much to carry around on top of like that's
And and like as because from the nursing perspective, I'm like, yep, yeah, that it's contaminated for sure. And we go, but like, I'm not saying that nurses like we're great, okay, but we also don't see what happens after that, and like, I don't know if I would pick up on that afterwards and be like, oh my gosh, I just put that on to his wife that like we're like, okay, she didn't pass. We'll try again tomorrow. Don't worry, it's okay. It's okay. We'll try. And this is how you do it. Okay, I have to go to room 187, and you
Mhm.
keep moving
I'm
on.
sure this lady, like, she wasn't mean, or this
Right.
nurse was
No.
lovely
Exactly.
and
But to
very
say
matter
that
of
we actually pick
fact.
up on it, I don't know. I don't know. Like I don't
Yeah.
know if I'd be like, I'm so sorry. Like I
Yeah, I don't think to this day, I don't even know if she still works there, but I'm like, I bet she has no idea that when she left that room,
yeah.
Jamie literally exploded at me
Right. Ripped you
and
to
ripped
shreds.
me to shreds. I already felt horrible as it was.
Oh.
And, Courtney definitely knows this. I am type A perfectionist. I had studied my heart out for that bad test.
No.
And to know I failed was like I failed him. And he was in that bed another day because of me. And he
Dear.
really wasn't very nice. I think he had been in hospital about 6 weeks at that point. He was really struggling mentally with that long time frame. I did pass the next day, thank God. But
Of course you did. Of course you
But
did.
like it's so
Of
interesting
course
though
you
because
did.
like those feelings, Jamie being upset, you being frustrated with yourself, those feelings aren't on anybody. Like all of those
Mhm.
reactions make perfect sense, but like what an extra it's so emotional what the caregiver experience is. Like there's a lot of focus on the patient, rightfully so, but like there is a lot that the caregiver has to take on and you have to kind of not you can't break. You have to be able to hold it all and
Yeah.
hold it together. It's a lot of responsibility and a lot of pressure.
yeah, and obviously did these not knowing I would ever, ever share them, let alone publicly. And I look at it now and I really, I struggled with this about do I share this? This is completely personal to me and was my innermost thoughts, feelings, deepest, darkest secrets. And I chatted with my committee about it. I went back and forth on it and I said, you know what? Like, if I do this and if it helps one person, it'll be worth it. Because I think a lot of people are probably feeling that exact same way, but we're all afraid to say it out loud.
100%.
100%.
So,
100%.
What also
100%.
kind of on the same note, just of these little stories of Jamie and just on his mental health. What is it like for you to talk about Jamie and share all these stories and relive all these times where, like you said, he was miserable and he wasn't himself. He kind of became this very anxious and depressed version of himself. What is it like to relive your relationship with him when it wasn't really at its best for totally understandable reasons.
I think it's the truth. I think it's raw. I think it's honest, but it's also ironic too, because when somebody dies, and I think this happens for most people, that person becomes almost godlike or angel-like. We put them on this pedestal, and Jamie was a wonderful person. He was awesome, but in death, you become even more awesome. And I'm lucky that it was only, I want to say, maybe a 6-month period that he was completely miserable. I was with him almost 10 years. So 6 months out of 10 years is not too bad. And even when he was miserable, there were still lots of things that I chuckle at now and I think about. This is another thing that I think, humor plays into it, dark humor plays into it, and you need to be able to connect with people who get it. And there used to be so many times I would say, Jamie, you're not going to need a heart transplant because I'm going to kill you before the time comes because you're driving me nuts.
If you don't smarten up.
Yeah, and it's funny because, funny enough, like I said, these interviews totally threw me. There was one caregiver who made a similar comment about saying to someone that she wanted to kill her husband because he was so irritable, and using a Newfoundland word, contrary is the word that she used, which just means very irritable and easily angered and things like that. So I totally appreciate it, but I love talking about Jamie. I love telling the story. I'm slowly learning that it's not Jamie's story but my story too, and I feel like the more I talk about it, the more people get to meet him and know him. Courtney and I talk all the time, and I sometimes forget that Courtney never met him because
Sometimes I do too.
I was about to say, I'm like, Courtney, do you feel like sometimes you,
I feel like I know him, like through
I don't-
Heather, and knowing Heather's sense of humor and just hearing stories about him and stuff, and just how Heather is. I can picture her perfect counterpart that made her the way that she is. So I feel like I know him too.
honestly, I thank God every day for caregivers like yourself, because when I have a patient, especially in this new role as a coordinator, I thank them so much. I'm like, you are the perfect patient. Thank you so much. You seriously got a good one. I said that to one of my patients last week. I was like, you got a good one. You really found a solid gem. And he's like, yeah, everybody keeps telling me that. I'm like, she's really great. But it's sad because not everybody has a person that is as good as a caregiver as someone like yourself, Heather.
I think it's also lucky though that, like we were kind of talking about before, Brittany, I think it was you who said that, like, it's just so lucky that Heather had kind of all of this knowledge in her pocket already and just had to kind of, not saying that it's not hard to apply it to when it's happening to you, but it's,
no,
so
it
many
is
people
hard.
have to
It is
fill,
it is
and
hard.
so many people have to
It is
fill
hard.
a role that they've never filled before.
That they've never played. They're wearing so many hats.
Yeah, you're the nurse, the pharmacist, the doctor. I was social work, rehab. He was doing an exercise program. I was dietitian. I was home making ketchup with no salt, meal planning, all that kind of stuff.
Heather has like the stories of Heather and like her domesticity and her just how rigorous you were with like making Jamie his own sodium-free ketchup. Like, dang,
that's love.
Yeah,
that's
like,
love. That's love. Okay.
Yeah. And and that's like a perfect example because I'm sure, Britt, this fluid balance is so important.
Yeah.
Measuring pee, like,
I
you ever want someone to measure pee? I'm your girl. Like, I know how to measure
that's
pee.
another
like...
thing that I don't know how to tell my patients. I'm like, I don't know how to tell you this, but you need to, what goes in must come out.
Yeah, right.
And tell me when there's a deficit.
I've measured pee. What else have I done that's really funny? So with the VAD, you can't, I think they now have shower bags, but at the time they didn't have that. So you can't get a shower because you can't get the VAD wet. So like we were sponge bathing Jamie for like 2 years. And I think I used to end up covered in way more water and soap than Jamie. I don't even know, like picture bathing your dog in your bathtub and like times it by a 200-pound man. Like it was just really funny. Yeah, no, just like it was just hilarious. And even stuff like, and he used to tell this story, so I'm not telling anything that he wouldn't mind, but like he, at one point he had a rectal bleed and needed to go to the hospital. And I had enough foresight to get a Tupperware container and a plastic spoon and scoop the feces out of the toilet and bring it with me. And
Nice,
that
Heather.
ER nurse loved me and said that I was awesome. And Jamie was like, "You're disgusting." And I'm like, "Yeah."
You're disgusting.
But I had all the supplies, right? I had the sterile gloves. I had the whole, I was
Yes.
like, we need to bring a stool sample and pack it up in my sandwich
Segue.
container and take it on.
Heather, what's next for your research? Like where does all this go from here?
So the research is in the writing stage, which I'm super excited about. So writing up the findings, I'm really lucky to go to a school that doesn't require us to do like that big formal theses, that 500-page thing that nobody really ever reads. So I'm actually doing a really cool project. It's a portfolio. So we can choose different elements and use that to present our work. It's a really creative way to showcase what you've done. The first thing I did, I had wanted to do a TED Talk because I was like, that's going to get out to patients, families. It's very user friendly. Everybody loves them. That was my initial thought. And then COVID hit and obviously TED Talk wasn't happening. So I hired a videographer who coincidentally, his partner donated a part of her liver to her dad. And he helped me make a short documentary which showcased my story as well as the research. So that piece is done. And once I get the final stamps of approval and everything from school, I'll be putting that out on YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And then to write 2 journal articles and another paper. So all the papers should be done. And then I defend. This podcast is a part of what I can use to get the word out. I'll go to conferences. I've been accepted to a bunch in the next couple of months to present. But after that, I really don't know. I really just want to lie in the sun and read a trashy novel.
You deserve it.
Who doesn't? I think we all want that at this point, but you absolutely deserve it.
Yeah,
100%.
after doing school and working at the same time for the last 4 years, I feel I just need a break, but I get bored easy, so the break might last, a month or 2. But yeah, who knows what'll happen. I already work, in a transplant center. Courtney asked me probably a year ago. I can picture where we were when she asked me. It was at a bar having happy hour drinks. And she said, if you could have any job, what would it be? What would your dream job be? And I told her my dream job was to work in transplant at Toronto General. And I said, oh my God, I need a new dream. I have my dream job. And it was to work. Yeah, it was to work at Toronto General Transplant. Yeah. So I thought
That's amazing.
that was kind of neat. So I don't have a new dream yet. Will I do a postdoc? We'll see.
I was about to say, would you do another PhD?
I told my dad the other day I'd like to be a surgeon, a transplant surgeon.
You should do it.
Going back to school for a casual 10 years. Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know. Now that I've started to really talk about the nitty gritty of what happened to me, that book idea that I had so long ago might be a possibility. I want to help patients and caregivers. I think research does that, but even in my current role, my favorite part is that one-on-one interaction with people. I miss that so much during COVID, like actually physically being there with somebody who's going through the journey.
And you are so good at that too. When we were talking about blending the academic and the personal, or the professional and the personal, you are truly incredible at that. Because I think it just comes to you naturally to you be the person that you wish you had. You have that mindset in every interaction you go into with people, and you do a fantastic job. I think we're so lucky to have you, and I'm so happy to work alongside you.
You really are my bestie. And I miss sitting by you every day because of COVID.
I'm so glad to have you on the show. Like I said, we need more people in this world. Our patients need more people like yourself as a support person and as a caregiver. So thank you for being that caregiver for Jamie and conducting this research on it and shedding a light on how important it is for these people to be recognized.
Absolutely. I think you're so unique, Heather, in the way that you have had this personal experience, and just the way that you are and the way that your brain works. You're also able to use that personal experience and look at it with a research hat and go down this kind of road with this perspective that a lot of people like wouldn't be able to do, just to kind of relive that experience constantly. But I think it's something amazing and unique about you, and I love it.
It
Yeah,
is recorded, right?
it's been fun. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
recorded.
Yeah, as we've been saying, I sit next to Courtney when it's non-COVID, and I've been, hearing about all the wonderful things and about the podcasts and the guests, and I listen myself. So, totally honored to sit with you guys and chat, and hopefully help somebody else who might be having some challenges or struggles along the way. So, thanks, guys, so much for having me.
Stuck here in the big city, wondering what to do. Trying hard with all my might just to get back home to you. My blood rolls through my veins, you see, just like my love for you. But that will not really matter much if the heart I have is not new. My love for you is flowing continuously, you'll see. This pumping runs on RPMs, no more heartbeats for me. My love for you, it sounds more like the motor of a GT. I need to get on that transplant list just to get back home to thee. The doctors do their very best to keep me going strong. You're never far from my mind, dear. My machine keeps pumping on. Let's go to the bridge. Watch your mind, having trouble sleeping, honey. You're always on my mind. Spend my time thinking, wishing I was drinking more than 3 bottles of water at a time. So please, love, do not worry. I'm not losing hope. I'm getting back to you right soon. This is not a joke. You're just battling to get over the hump. Never forget I love you, dear, from the bottom of my palm. My love is flowing continuously, you'll see. The pumping runs on RPMs, no more heartbeats for me. My love for you, it sounds more like the motor of a GT. I need to get on that transplant list just to get back home to thee. My love for you, it sounds more like the motor of a GT. I need to get on that transplant list just to get back home to thee. I need to get on that transplant list just to get back home to thee.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Living Transplant. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, email us at livingorgandonation@uhn.ca.
Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Living Transplant on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
And follow us at GiveLifeUHN on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
See you next time.